The day I walked away from my own life, the California sun was as harsh and unforgiving as a judge's verdict. I stood on the neat, familiar lawn of the house my husband and I had built, every brick bought with sacrifice, clutching a single crumpled check. $300,000. It wasn't a fortune to me, it was my foundation, the quiet, comfortable dignity I'd earned after 40 years of teaching and a decade of widowhood. But to my son, Michael, it was the necessary price for keeping his life with Savannah from imploding. My name is Eleanor Cole. I'm 61, a recently retired English teacher from Sacramento, a woman who believed in accountability, honor, and the unconditional bond of motherhood. I never broke a law, I never broke a promise, and I certainly never thought I'd be forced to break the heart of the only child I had. It wasn't the number that froze the air in my lungs. I could pay it, barely. It was the absolute unblinking entitlement in Michael's eyes that shattered the decades of loving memory. Michael, my sweet, sensitive boy, stood on the porch with his perfectly tailored suit and his hand resting on his wife, Savannah, who looked less like a victim and more like a viper that had just struck. Savannah, whose clandestine, crushing debt, a result of a secret, high-stakes gambling addiction, had just landed on my doorstep. "Mom," Michael had said, his voice a flat, dead thing, devoid of apology or affection. "You have to do this. We're family. You can't let us lose everything." I looked at him, at the stranger who wore my son's face, and saw the ghosts of every sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the second mortgage, the postponed dreams, crumble into dust. He wasn't asking for help. He was leveraging my deepest, oldest love against my very survival. And in that shattering moment, the Eleanor Cole who valued family above all else died. A new woman was born. A phantom, a runaway, a mother ready to disappear without a trace. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just crumpled the check and looked up at the perfect blue sky, making a silent vow. I will not pay for her sin, and I will not watch my son sacrifice his soul for her. I turned, walked to my trusty old sedan, and drove away from Sacramento, leaving behind my name, my memories, and the woman I used to be. The only thing I took was the haunting image of my son's demand, which became the bitter fuel for my flight. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe now to support me and motivate me to make more such videos. Do let me know in the comments of where you're watching from. The first 100 miles were a blur of grief and highway asphalt. I was driving south, away from the familiar, orderly streets of Northern California, my mind a relentless tape loop of disbelief and white-hot anger. I kept seeing Michael's face, not the 6-year-old bundled up for his first snowball fight, but the 30-year-old man, cold and demanding, standing next to the woman who was systematically dismantling his future. I pulled over at a dusty, forgotten rest stop near the Grapevine, the air thick with the smell of dry sage and distant industry. I stared at my reflection in the sedan's side mirror. I looked ancient, face etched with exhaustion, my silk blouse rumpled, my eyes sunken and raw. "He chose her debt over his mother," I whispered to the empty cab, the words catching in my throat like shards of glass. Savannah, a beautiful, raven-haired woman from a wealthy Boston family whose charm was a weapon and whose addiction was a black hole. When Michael first introduced her, I'd felt a familiar, sharp, maternal instinct, a deep sense of alarm I foolishly pushed aside. She was too glamorous, her compliments too smooth, her dependence on Michael too immediate, almost suffocating. She had a way of elevating him while simultaneously making him entirely reliant on her needs. The $300,000 wasn't for noble reasons. It was for a high-limit marker at a high-end Atlantic City casino, a debt she'd concealed until the threats became real and the bill collectors started calling their pristine new home. Michael, paralyzed by shame and denial, had immediately turned to the source he knew would never fail him. Me. His plea was devastatingly simple, strategically framed to exploit my love. If we file for bankruptcy, it ruins my chances for partnership, Mom. Savannah's family cut her off years ago. You're the only one with the liquid assets. We'll pay you back. I promise. But I knew Savannah's history. An undisclosed history of debt and manipulation that Michael had minimized to me, calling it creative accounting. This wasn't creative. It was destructive. And by asking me to pay, Michael was choosing to protect his facade of success, his wife's reputation, and his fear of conflict over his mother's financial security. The realization was the truest form of heartbreak. My son valued his illusion of perfection more than my peace and comfort. I pulled out my burner phone, a cheap prepaid I'd bought during a clandestine trip to an out-of-town electronics store, and called my estate attorney, Mr. Harold Jenkins, a kind, steady man who had handled my late husband's affairs. Harold, it's Eleanor. I need you to execute a series of transactions immediately before the markets open on Monday. My voice was steady, betraying none of the seismic shift occurring inside me. I instructed him to liquidate everything, my investment accounts, my remaining stocks, the few bonds I held, and wire the majority, about $850,000, into a newly established anonymous numbered account in the Bahamas. A grim, dark contingency I'd opened after my husband passed, purely as an irrational fear of being destitute. Eleanor, what is going on? This sounds like panic. Is Michael involved in something illegal? Harold's voice was sharp with professional concern. No, Harold, this is a choice. Call it an extreme permanent sabbatical. The remaining $50,000 will be put into a restricted trust for Michael. He cannot touch it until he provides documented proof of having filed for divorce from Savannah and completing 6 months of intensive therapy. No negotiation. Tell him it's the only inheritance he gets from me. Tell him I've gone to ground. There was a pregnant silence. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Eleanor, Harold finally said, his tone heavy with dread. Michael is going to interpret this as a complete and utter abandonment. He's going to tell everyone you simply ran away. Let him, I said, a cold, bitter clarity settling into my bones. I am teaching him the only lesson he can still learn. He needs to lose everything to realize what matters. Now, please execute the transfers, and when the authorities inevitably call, and they will, you tell them I was distraught over my husband's death and simply decided to travel the world using cash, cutting all ties. I'm a woman who closed her accounts and simply vanished. I hung up, severing the last fragile thread of my old life. The money was safe. The debt was not mine, and I was free. Free but shattered into a million pieces. My first destination was Reno, Nevada, the biggest little city in the world. I chose it specifically for its proximity to the Sierras and its air of anonymity, a place where desperation and fleeting hope coexist, and where an older woman with cash is simply a tourist. I spent the next 2 days meticulously erasing Eleanor Cole. I went to a high-end salon and had my classic silver bob dyed a severe, deep auburn. I bought harsh, practical clothes with cash, a wardrobe of anonymity, plain parkas, black jeans and work boots. I exchanged my tasteful silver jewellery for a set of cheap costume pieces. I bought a set of large, square, tinted glasses that drastically altered the shape of my face. When I checked into a generic, extended-stay motel on the city's outskirts, I signed the ledger as Esther Hayes. "Looking for a long vacation, dear?" the night clerk asked brightly. "Just quiet," I replied, my voice deliberately lowered and roughened. Absolute quiet. The room was clean, sterile, and utterly without personality. It was perfect. The ultimate luxury was the silence, the absence of the phone ringing, the emails, the expectations. The first few weeks were a brutal immersion into solitude. Every morning I woke expecting the familiar weight of my dog, Buster, on the bed, the familiar smell of my own brewing Earl Grey tea. Instead, there was the stale air of the motel and the distant whoop of a siren. I started volunteering, not in a library or a museum, but at a busy, no-kill animal shelter far from my motel. It was messy, demanding work. Cleaning kennels, feeding animals, walking the hyperactive dogs. The physical exhaustion was a welcome narcotic. The animals asked nothing of me except immediate, basic care. They didn't know Eleanor Cole, and they certainly didn't know Michael. The pain, however, was a deep, throbbing ache. I realized the crux of my decision wasn't just about the money. It was about Michael's character. Had I shielded him too much? Had I provided a life so cushioned that he never learned the essential dignity of facing his own failures? He asked me for $300,000, Eleanor. He didn't ask her to get a job or liquidate her diamond rings. He came to you expecting. The internal monologue was a merciless whip. I knew my disappearance would trigger a formal investigation. I needed a final definitive act. The Reno airport offered a remote final stage. One icy morning, I drove my sedan, which was registered to a fictitious shell company I'd created months ago, to a long-term parking lot at the Reno Tahoe International Airport. I spent an hour in the sedan composing 2 final letters. The first, addressed to Harold Jenkins, contained instructions for my eventual house sale and the establishment of a very small scholarship fund in my husband's name. The second letter was addressed simply to Michael. It was 400 words of condensed, agonizing truth. I told him I loved him, but that love had a price: accountability. I explained that I was choosing my financial independence because he had chosen his wife's debt over his own integrity. The letter ended with a heart-breaking farewell, implying I was leaving the country permanently to find peace and demanding he find his own path without the illusion of a safety net. It was a cruel kindness. I placed both letters inside a worn leather briefcase, a gift from my husband, along with my official passport, now expired, a few sentimental photographs, and my distinctive wedding band. I locked the briefcase and drove to a small, seldom-used employee parking structure. I purchased a cheap one-way bus ticket to Salt Lake City, paid cash, and checked my briefcase with the bus company, addressed to a non-existent hotel in Salt Lake City, knowing it would eventually be flagged as unclaimed baggage. The most important step was next. I drove back to the airport parking structure, found a remote corner, and abandoned my sedan. I used my burner phone to send an anonymous tip to the police, reporting a suspicious vehicle with an elderly woman's belongings and a distress note inside, hinting at overwhelming depression. The police would find the car, the hint of a woman in crisis, and eventually the unclaimed briefcase at the bus station. The passport and wedding band would confirm the identity of Eleanor Cole, depressed and likely seeking oblivion abroad, or perhaps already succumbing to desperation in the vast anonymity of the West. The letter to Michael would serve as the final, sad confirmation of my intentions. I took the bus to Salt Lake City, where I quickly bought another ticket, this time to Spokane, Washington. I was shedding my skin, layer by layer, burying the mother who couldn't bear the truth. Eleanor Cole was gone. Esther Hayes was born. My destination was the remote wilderness of the Idaho Panhandle. I had secured a job, sight unseen, as a caretaker for a cluster of rustic off-grid cabins owned by a taciturn former park ranger named Daniel Dan Miller. Dan needed a responsible person to manage bookings and maintain the properties during the harsh winter months, paying cash and asking no personal questions. The isolation was immediate and profound. My small cabin had no cell service, no television, and internet only via a temperamental satellite link. The nearest town was 50 miles away. The work was relentless, splitting firewood, digging out snow, maintaining the tricky septic systems. It was a harsh physical life, a far cry from my life as a teacher, grading papers by a fire. The physical exertion quelled the anxiety, but it couldn't touch the emptiness. I missed Michael with a crushing, maternal intensity. I missed the sound of his laugh, the way he'd light up a room. I lived in a constant state of agonizing speculation. Is he okay? Did he read the letter? Is he finally separating from Savannah? The guilt of abandoning him, even for his own salvation, was my constant companion. I had hoped the trauma of my disappearance would shock him into clarity. But what if it simply broke him? One late afternoon, while chopping wood outside my cabin, Dan pulled up on his snowmobile. He was a man of few words, but today his face was grim. "Esther," he said, handing me a small prepaid satellite phone, the kind they used for emergencies. "A woman called my landline in town, said it was urgent, asked for you specifically. She used your name, Esther Hayes." My blood ran cold. How? The only person who knew the name Esther Hayes was Dan and the woman who ran the animal shelter in Reno, and they were sworn to secrecy. "Who was it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Said she was your niece, Clara. Said she had an emergency and tracked you down through a long string of contacts at that shelter where you volunteered. Clara, my beloved niece, the daughter of my deceased sister. A sharp, brilliant lawyer who was the only one in the family who possessed the tenacity and intelligence to piece together the breadcrumbs I had left." I took the phone, my hand trembling violently. Clara wouldn't call unless the situation was dire. I retreated into the cabin and dialed the number Dan had provided. "Hello?" My voice was thick with dread. "Aunt Eleanor?" Clara's voice was strained, barely controlled. "It's Clara. Thank God. Don't deny it. I know it's you. I recognized your writing in the letter you left Michael. No one else uses quixotic in casual correspondence." A wave of defeated resignation washed over me. The English teacher had been exposed by her own vocabulary. "Clara, you must never tell anyone," I pleaded, "especially Michael. How did you find me?" "It doesn't matter, Aunt Eleanor. What matters is Michael. I have to tell you the truth about Savannah, and it's worse than we thought." I sank onto the rough wooden stool. Worse than $300,000 in gambling debt? Yes. Savannah wasn't just gambling and running up debt. She was involved with a local organised crime figure, a loan shark named Vinny the Ledger. When she ran off with the rest of Michael's equity, she didn't leave the country. She went into hiding, but Vinny is still looking for her. And he found Michael instead. A spike of ice pierced my chest. "What? What are you saying?" "Michael is divorced, Aunt Eleanor. He followed your instructions, filed the papers, and got the first therapy session under his belt. He was finally doing better. But Vinny and his associates tracked him down, thinking Michael knew where Savannah was, or that he had money from your estate. When they realized he was broke, they gave him an ultimatum. Pay $50,000 of her outstanding debt in 2 weeks, or they will make him disappear too." I gasped, a terrible sound that echoed in the tiny cabin. My tough love, my calculated vanishing had left my son exposed and vulnerable to true physical danger. I had intended to save his financial soul. Instead, I had put his very life in peril. "Where is he now, Clara?" My voice was low, harsh, stripped of all maternal softness. It was the voice of a woman fighting for her child. "He's in a safe house I arranged, a terrible hidden apartment in the grittier part of Chicago. But Vinny knows I'm his lawyer. He's threatened me too. Aunt Eleanor, the 2 weeks are almost up. The debt is real, the threat is real, and the police won't touch it. He needs the money." My meticulous plan to teach him a lesson had dissolved into a nightmare. I had to pay the debt after all, not as a handout, but as a ransom. "I'm coming, Clara," I said, a terrifying resolve settling over me. "Prepare the paperwork. I'm wiring the funds. But this time I'm not just paying the debt. I'm facing the monster." I hung up, staring at the snow-laden pines outside. Eleanor Cole was dead, but Esther Hayes, the protector, was about to emerge. 3 days later, I was in Chicago. The biting winter wind, a shocking contrast to the dry air of Idaho. I was wearing an expensive, anonymous winter coat I'd purchased on the trip and carrying a small, heavy backpack containing a large amount of cash. Clara met me in a secure but worn downtown office. She looked exhausted, but relieved. "Aunt Eleanor, I've arranged the meeting. It's in an abandoned warehouse tonight. We're going to use the $50,000 from the trust, which Michael couldn't access, as the initial payment, and I will issue a check from your offshore account for the remaining. But I can't go with you. It's too dangerous." "You won't have to," I said, looking at her with cold determination. "I am the one who cut the ties. I am the one who failed to protect him. I will be the one to pay and to confront this man." Clara handed me the final necessary item, a tiny, high-quality audio recorder, already running, tucked into the lining of my backpack. "Don't say anything incriminating. Just pay and get Michael out." That evening, I stood in the cavernous, freezing darkness of a dilapidated warehouse near the river. The air was thick with damp and decay. A single bare bulb hung above a scarred metal table. Vinny the ledger was exactly what I didn't expect. Short, impeccably dressed in a fine Italian suit, with a deceptively gentle face that held eyes as cold and flat as slate. He had 2 enormous bodyguards flanking him. I walked to the table, placing my backpack down. "You must be the mother," Vinny said, his voice soft, almost conversational. "We heard you were dead. A very dramatic exit, Eleanor Cole." I didn't flinch. I was on a necessary vacation. "I am here to settle the debt my son is being harassed over. I have the required $50,000 cash, and the rest via a certified check." "Ah, the legendary Eleanor Cole funds," Vinny drawled. "We appreciate your expediency. We figured your motherly instinct would override your financial discipline." "It has," I said, meeting his gaze directly. "But I have a condition." Vinny smiled, a chilling sight. "You're in no position for conditions, ma'am, but go ahead. The moment this money is paid, you provide me with a notarized document stating that Savannah's debt is completely satisfied and that Michael Cole is free of all claims, and will never be contacted again by you or your associates." Vinny laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "You're a fierce woman, Mrs. Cole, but that's not possible. Savannah created this debt. If she reappears, the debt follows her." "No," I insisted, my voice ringing with authority. "The debt follows my money. You accept this payment as final settlement for all outstanding claims related to Savannah and Michael Cole. If you refuse, I leave, and you get nothing. And you can explain to your superiors why you lost $300,000 because you wanted to play games with an old woman." The threat was clear. The money was already wired to a local bank. Vinny would have to chase it through layers of bureaucracy, and the delay would expose his operation. Vinny's eyes narrowed. He looked at his bodyguards, then back at me. He saw not a frail old woman, but a desperate mother holding a checkbook as a sword. "Fine," he spat out. "But if she surfaces, we come to you, Eleanor." "You won't have to," I said, pushing the backpack and the check toward him. "I'll find her first." I grabbed the hastily scribbled document he provided, signed by his associate, and walked out, the silence of the massive building deafening behind me. The recorder was still running. I had saved Michael, but I had placed a target on my own back. The debt was settled, but the war was not over. The next morning I was reunited with Michael in Clara's apartment. He was shocked, ashamed, and profoundly relieved. The shock of finding his dead mother was overshadowed by the terror of the previous weeks. "Mom," he whispered, collapsing onto the sofa. "You paid it. You faced him. I never thought I'd see you again." "I was running from the wrong thing, Michael," I said, sitting beside him. "I thought I was saving you from your choices. I should have been saving you from the consequences. I'm sorry I put you through this torture." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I deserved the scare, Mom. Savannah was gone and I realized I had traded you for a lie. Your letter, even the part where you implied, you know, it woke me up. It was the absolute loss of you that forced me to look at my life. The confession was the true payment. The $300,000 was just collateral. I didn't return to Idaho. I sold the Sacramento house, wired the remaining funds, and relocated to a small, quiet coastal town in Maine, Kennebunkport. Michael and I bought a dilapidated old lighthouse keeper's cottage together, right on the cliffs. It needed a full renovation, a project that would require years of focused, honest labour. I used the money to start a small, anonymous foundation that funded debt and addiction counselling for families. Michael didn't get a prestigious new job. He started a small local contracting business. He learned carpentry, plumbing, and electrical work. He learned to build something real with his hands, using his brain, not his credit line. 2 years later, the cottage was finished. The light pouring in from the refurbished windows was warm and honest. Michael, healthier, stronger, and more centered than I'd ever seen him, was sitting on the porch sketching plans for a new deck. "Mom," he said, looking up, "I ran into the old high school principal today. He asked if you were really teaching overseas like I told him." I smiled, sipping my tea. "What did you say?" "I said you'd retired early to find yourself, and that you finally did." "And you?" Michael looked out at the churning Atlantic, vast, beautiful, and demanding. "I paid my dues, Mom. I'm building a life I actually earned. The debt is gone, but the lesson is here to stay." He tapped his chest. "I'm grounded now, thanks to you." The danger was still out there, but we faced it together. The truth was out. The family bond, though nearly severed, had been reforged in fire and ice. My son demanded I pay the debt, and I ran. But in running, I paid a far greater price. I risked everything to teach him the value of his own life. The vanishing was the catalyst. The redemption was the reunion. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more stories. What part of Eleanor's sacrifice, the brutal decision to vanish, the agonizing 2 years of solitude as Esther Hayes, or the final confrontation with Vinny the Ledger, did you find the most emotionally engaging? Drop your comment below.